Hi, my name is Marion Patricio. Welcome to our first virtual UCLA Ventures Roundtable. Um, we wanted to start doing these sort of panel discussions to talk about different topics, and the recent deaths of George Floyd and other Black Americans at the hands of police have sparked an outpouring of statements from businesses, founders, and investors across the tech industry, which is notorious for its lack of diversity in hiring and investing. We at UCLA Ventures have strived to support and encourage Bruin entrepreneurs of all races, colors, and creeds. We've aimed to build a diverse community that reflects the values of this institution. At the same time, we realize that we have a platform to support and elevate Black entrepreneurs. So with that in mind, we worked with several longtime UCLA Ventures members to bring you this panel that examines the experiences and challenges faced by Black entrepreneurs. We hope that the next hour provides you with an opportunity to reflect on and learn from these experiences. We will have a Q&A portion towards the end of the hour, so feel free to submit any questions you have throughout the panel, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. For now, I'll quickly introduce the panelists, then we can jump right into the conversation. So first we have Mustafa Abdul Hamid. He is the co-founder and CEO of Boost. We also have Joe Kwong, the co-founder and CEO of Sprocket. Next we have Dr. Robert Dansby, the founder and CEO of Coferex, and Murray Raifus, CEO and co-founder of Talamus Health. And finally, then we have Mariah Lichtenstern, founding partner and managing director of Diversity Ventures and an Aspen Tech Policy Fellow. And finally, we have Alon Mavaz, a startup advisor. So thank you all for joining us on this panel today. I want to start by giving you all an opportunity to talk about your experiences, introduce sort of yourselves and your company, and for us to sort of hear about your path to entrepreneurship. So if anybody wants to start, otherwise I'll just go down the list. Okay, we can have Alon Mavaz start.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. My name's Alon Mavaz, and like I assume some of my other panelists, I went to UCLA, undergraduate, and I'll talk to you a little bit about my path to entrepreneurship. I went to UCLA, I did a major in French with a minor in math. I thought at some point I'd go on and do something in artificial intelligence, but life happened. I went on and worked in the banking industry. After several years, I decided to go to business school at what is now called the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California, where I got an MBA with a concentration in marketing, focusing on the international environment. From there, I graduated. I went to work at Wells Fargo in San Francisco. I worked at Intuit, where I joined new business initiatives, working on different products, and then back to LA to work at City National Bank, downtown LA, where I was again responsible for innovation and new products within the financial sector. As part of my job at City National, I interfaced pretty much weekly with investors, venture capitalists, and entrepreneurs as I was trying to build out the next generation platform for City National Bank. And along the way, I met some fantastic entrepreneurs, and I was solicited multiple times to join. And then I found a company that I really believed in, and I left City National Bank to become the CEO of Vray, which was a payment company that helps with secure payments. Ran that for about 2 years and left last year, but had a fantastic set of experiences. Got accepted into an accelerator in Northern California, Southern California, raised angel money. And now I advise a few different companies and my time in trying to eke out a living.
Nice, thank you. Next, we can jump to Mariah. You are the founding partner of Diversity Ventures, an impact-oriented venture capital firm, but you've done so many other things since your time at UCLA. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Because I'm getting old. These gray hairs under the light. Thank you, Ilan, for setting the pace, and thank you, Marion. And I want to just express appreciation for one, having a safe place to be here, and everyone who's involved in creating this panel and forum. I want to thank Brandon and UCLA Ventures just for reaching out and taking action during this time. And I really want to express gratitude to the people listening in, because I mean, we live this, right? And it's hard having to have these conversations. I think sometimes people think that we're like, poor me. And there's like certain, common refrains that come up when the subject of diversity or Black Lives Matter happens. And it's not a comfortable conversation to have. It's just that because it impacts us day to day, we have to have those conversations, or we have to just be complacent. And so I just want to express the gratitude and commend people for leaning into difficult conversations during this time, and for people really opening their eyes and their hearts to what's going on, and letting us, share openly and transparently, and having the empathy to recognize that these aren't easy discussions for anyone, and we recognize that as well. So just in terms of my journey, my entrepreneurial journey started as an undergrad at UC Berkeley. I was actually a liberal arts major, rhetoric. My major was rhetoric of narrative and the image, and I had minors in ethnic studies, English, and Pan-African studies. And I happened to be a mixed person, so that kind of informed my interest in trying to figure out, like, with my experiences growing up in a very rural community, having, mixed parents, but being raised with, white mom, white stepdad, Black sibling, or mixed sibling like myself, why we had the experiences and hostility that we had towards us for things that we couldn't control. So that kind of influenced my path. And while at undergrad, at UC Berkeley is so diverse, California, we're a pretty diverse state. So a lot of exposure. And one of my friends was, he was working at what was then Solomon Smith Barney, and he turned me on to this book by Robert Kiyosaki called The Cash Flow Quadrant, some of you might be familiar with. So that was really my first introduction to entrepreneurship as a potential career pathway. I'd always kind of subscribed to the notion of, you go to school, you work as hard as you can to get into the best college you can, to get the best job that you can. I knew nothing about like wage gap. I thought my mom burned her bra so that, we wouldn't have to deal with sexism. I thought MLK and Malcolm X and JFK, did the whole civil rights thing for us. So I had no idea beyond, the interpersonal experiences, that there were systemic issues until I went to college and learned and studied, devoted to myself to studying these things. So this was my first exposure to entrepreneurship, reading Cash Flow Quadrant. And the thing that really resonated was, when I looked around in the community I lived in Oakland, California, where I was born, and I saw economic problems driving almost every other problem, whether it's education, disparities in every aspect. So I saw entrepreneurship as a way that we could solve for some of those problems. And my thesis had been on representations of people of color in the media, and mainstream hip hop is modern day minstrelsy. So I gravitated towards the motion picture industry as a path to entrepreneurship. I started a production company, boutique production company with my loan refund and half of my contract prepaid to buy equipment and whatnot to fulfill my first contract. And that was my path to entrepreneurship. So there's what I found there, and I'm sure we'll have opportunity to talk more about our entrepreneurial experiences, but becoming an entrepreneur freed me up from having to work 20 to 30 hours per week. So I was actually able to take on an internship to apply to grad school and study for the GRE. I had emancipated from foster care, and, I had to work my way through college. So I didn't come from my parents paying my way. Even though I would see all these writings about affirmative action admits not being, and all this, all these biases I would encounter on campus in that era, I worked really, really hard to be there and stay there. And entrepreneurship freed me up to do more things and to actually pave the path to grad school. So that was my first experience with entrepreneurship.
Thank you, Mariah. Next, we'll go to Mustafa. How did you go from being a player in one of UCLA's Final Four teams to starting your own companies, including Boost?
Yeah, so I'm Mustafa Abdul Hamid, and I'll mirror that sentiment. I'm glad to be on this panel and speaking with all of you all. Thanks for putting it together. Yeah, it was fun. I got to play on those Final Four teams, and we had some good teams. I got to sit and watch Russell and Drew and a lot of these guys play. And there were a couple of big moments that I had while we were playing. And those moments and sort of efficiency that I had on the court gave me the opportunity to play internationally in Europe. So I played lived a couple of years in Germany and France and Serbia, Slovenia, even in Lebanon for a bit. And while I was there, I started building a company. And that company is what has become Boost. Now, Boost today, we build and deploy artificial intelligence pipelines, and we use those and we extend traditional data sets with computer vision. So it's an AI and computer vision company that is locked in and focused on sports and sports analytics right now. So it's pretty cool. We take two-dimensional broadcast video, we extract data from there, and we create stories with those data, and we deliver them to teams and coaches and staffs. So you can see the basketball link. It kind of comes together there between playing at UCLA and internationally, and then starting this company. The big thing for me and one of my big interests has always been policy, however. So I studied global studies at UCLA undergrad, global studies and macro communications and political communications was my other major. After playing, I left playing early and did my grad work at Stanford and got a master's in international policy. So I'll bring this together. The year I came back was when Michael Brown was shot and killed, and I'm from Florissant, which Florissant starts here and Ferguson starts there. You don't really know where they start and end. All these tiny little towns and the history of how these small cities sort of funded themselves and how redlining played into that. It's a weird little fragmented system. And so when I came back, everything, it exploded. And so being there when we were protesting and sort of the visceral experience of something being in your hometown and right there really impacted me. So I went to Stanford and met a woman named Lodoris Cordell, who was an independent police auditor in San Jose. And this is when I started my second company. And what we did was we would build these post-police contact surveys or interactions. Just like you go to AT&T, you get a customer satisfaction survey. Well, there's 53 million interactions between police and community members every year, and there's zero data. So that's the company the size of Comcast not knowing what interactions between their customers are like or what is happening. So we built that out, and a citywide 5-year deal in Austin, Texas, which is being deployed now, and that has really grown. And for me, it became a point where now I am full-time and I lead Boost, and I recruited the best person ever to run my 90, and she's my wife. She went to grad school with me, and she's raising money and growing. We've grown the team, done a decent amount, raised angel money, but now is raising a full seed round. And so that's what's going on with my 90, and I'm an advisor. And with Boost, we just closed a seed round. The lead was a group called Titletown Tech, which is a joint venture between Microsoft and the Green Bay Packers. And so they've given us a tremendous amount of resources, and that's been exciting because they're going to help us expand, like I said, build and deploy AI pipelines, and we use computer vision to extend that. So sports was just a start. So that's kind of my background and how I grew up in the startup ecosystem.
Thank you, and congrats on raising that seed round.
Yeah,
a little later, we're going to get into venture capital funding and the challenges of that as well. So, but now I think I wanted to segue into asking Joe Kwong about how he sort of got into your current company. Deals a little bit with working on prison reform. And so we wanted to sort of figure out how you got there, what kinds of things you saw that got you to start this company.
Thank you. And it's really an honor to be with this group. And I feel really happy to have been a UCLA grad. I went to film school there, and I would say most of my life has been spent in traditional film and television. When I was at UCLA Film School, the first company I started was with a guy that I had gone to grammar school with, and we're both in film school. And the first film we made was a documentary that happened to win an Oscar in a short documentary form. And that kind of launched all our careers. And I spent quite a bit of time at PBS making documentaries, and many of those won Emmys. So we were fairly well ensconced there. And then I started moving more into fictional film. And at the time that I was working on a script for Jodie Foster, I got approached by Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and they said, look, the dropout rate amongst students of color in high school is close to 70 to 80% in most of our cities. Can you do something, since you have worked at PBS and at MTV, to try and stem that dropout rate? So we built a web-based education tool that turned out to be very flexible and worked in a lot of different areas, especially with the lowest performing quartile. And that's when we got approached by Ben Jealous, who had left the NAACP and was at a philanthropic venture capital firm called Caper Capital. And he said, look, if you become a for-profit and focus purely on criminal justice, I will help you start the company. And I want you to focus on people coming out of prison and try and tamp down the recidivism rate. So that was 2015, and we've been doing that pretty much ever since. And it's been a fascinating ride. Our first technologies were built by coders overseas, but I soon met folks in an entrepreneur program that was in San Quentin. Most of them were inmates of color. And they were really doing a good job of coding. And I said, look, I have to rebuild my technology, which is called Sprocket. And would you guys like to do it? And they took a look at it and said, great, we'll jump in. And so most of my coders are either currently incarcerated or previously incarcerated. And the technology is being deployed all over the United States, and not just for reentry. Now it's being used in prison, it's used in parole, it's used a lot in pretrial diversion for offenders with mental health issues. And then now we just deployed this week in the Central Courthouse of Los Angeles for an alternative to bail program. So rather than incarcerate someone who can't afford to pay bail, they now put them on Sprocket, and we'll keep our fingers crossed that we can get them back to court on time. But the technology is very interesting in that I took a lot of what I learned from filmmaking, is that it's always about engagement of the end user. The more engaged they are, the more you can transform. And that's what we try to do with gamification. And then also providing incentives that are given by corporate social responsibility, whether it's Lyft or Uber or Safeway or Albertsons, to give privileges and rewards to the clients who are really changing their lives and doing things to reintegrate into society. And so it allows citizens to really connect with these end users. The thing that really changed for us over the last few months was the virus. And I had built into the application a video conferencing feature, so that now, whether you're a case manager or a probation officer, you can stay connected with your client using the video conferencing. And the other thing is that there are criminal justice technologies out there, but they're very invasive in terms of privacy, in that they track the end user kind of like Uber cars on a map. So they see where you are at any given moment of the day or night. And my attitude towards that was that if you've served your time, you deserve to walk as a free person as long as you fulfill your requirements. So we're probably the most compassionate technology out there, and we are also trying to serve all the stakeholders during the pandemic to keep everybody safe.
Yeah, it's very interesting technology. Next, we will go to Robert Dansby. Since your time as a student at UCLA, you've developed and grown several startups in the biotech industry. Can you tell us about your experience forming these and growing these startups? You're muted. Robert, you're muted right now. Can you unmute your mic? I can't do it for you, sorry.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's great to participate in this panel discussion. It's intriguing to learn about what everybody is doing, really exciting things. I'm sure there's more to come. In terms of my own UCLA experience, I came to UCLA as a graduate student in math. I received a master's degree in math from UCLA, and to date myself, it was during the Arcindor era, Sidney Wicks and all those guys. So I'm probably the long distance runner on this panel. While at UCLA, I had the great fortune to meet some people who were recruiting for Bell Laboratories, and that was during my second quarter at UCLA. I wasn't ready to look for a job at the time, but they told me when I was ready to give them a call. Later I did. I joined Bell Labs in the mathematics research department. Subsequently got a PhD from NYU. I spent about 25 years at Bell Labs doing research related to various technical problems that could utilize applied math as part of the solution set. So in terms of my path to entrepreneurship, I would say that it began in the research department, being a research entrepreneur, because we had the opportunity to pick and choose the projects that we worked on. And certainly picking the right problem is one of the first challenges in being a successful entrepreneur. So I was fortunate to work on a number of interesting research projects over the years. After that experience, I was one of 3 people that formed a corporate venture, internal venture operation at Bell Labs, and we were responsible for identifying, nurturing, and building new businesses based on Bell Labs technology. The funding was provided by Bell Labs and AT&T, and it was doing that corporate entrepreneurship experience that I first got involved in working on healthcare related ventures. We built one of the first health information systems that was subsequently sold to Columbia Presbyterian. We built with a team of entrepreneurs the first programmable hearing aid that was ultimately spun off from Bell Labs and taken public as a public company. I left the internal venture organization after about 6 years, moved over to AT&T Corporate Mergers, spent about 2 years there, and then took an early retirement, and I've been doing private entrepreneurship ever since, working on a number of different ventures, but most of them around the digital health arena. There are a couple that were not, but they are all related. right? Because in terms of digital communication, we did one of the very first VoIP gateways, and that has come a long way since the time, because now digital video over the internet is commonplace. Back then, it was very difficult. Right now, I'm focused on a number of ventures, 3 in particular, in the digital health space. Cafarix is focused on telemedicine. It began life under a joint effort with CVS Minute Clinic that ran its course, and now we are coming into a new era in telemedicine, and it's a good place to be because we have developed some really, really interesting technology to support distributed healthcare, we call it telehealth, distributed health, and much of that is focused on providing solutions to support visiting nurses associations and other home health organizations. I think I'll leave it at that, and we can talk more about details later.
Perfect. And this is the perfect segue for our final panelist, Mary. You are also in the health space. So I really want to hear about your journey to the US, to earning an MD, and to starting Talamus Health.
Yeah, so I was born in Ghana. Parents are both Ghanaian and Nigerian, but I got a scholarship when I was 15 years old to come to the United States for high school. So I left my family when I was 15, ended up in Minnesota. Minneapolis, I know Minneapolis is known for a different thing right now, but I ended up in Minneapolis for high school. Then from high school, went to college at on the East Coast at Amherst. So after that, did a little stint on Wall Street, then back to med school and residency, finished my residency at UCLA in 2008, and headed over back to New York. I had spent time in New York before to work. So I was with the Columbia University, Cornell NYP system, the New York Presbyterian system, for about 5 years, practicing as a neurosurgeon. And then during that time, you know, when I left home, I always wanted to be able to do something that kind of helped improve healthcare for everybody. So while I was practicing in New York, that kind of kept eating at me. So I took a sabbatical for a year to get my master's at the Kennedy School. So while I was there, I spent some time with Clayton Christensen at the business school and kind of talked about how do you go about really changing how healthcare is experienced. Because from a physician point of view, I knew there were issues with how patients experience healthcare. But my mom also got sick, and helping her trying to get better also, I saw it from that side as well. So when I finished, instead of going back to my old job, I decided to come back to LA. And came to LA, started my practice again with one of my co-residents from UCLA, but then started in parallel Talamus Health, which is a mobile platform that is also looking at this idea of distributed and federated care, as opposed to this siloed care, right? Where the patient just kind of has to fit into what they find. We want whatever is there to fit into how what the patient needs at any point in time. I decided in particular that we wanted to do this on the continent of Africa. So we're in 4 countries right now. We're in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and Ghana. We have been doing a lot of work around COVID. We're doing work with the African Union and the Africa CDC, and helping some governments also manage their COVID situations at the moment. We are also being approached by folks in Latin America to kind of partner to do some work there. And we are starting the process. We've had a lot of conversation about launching here in the United States because we think, you know, the problems that our platform solves is a very universal one. And we see a lot of spaces that we can actually soft spots in the ecosystem. I mean, there are big players, but there are some soft spots in the ecosystem that we feel like we can go and really make a difference. So that's my journey, and that's where we are.
Nice, that's fascinating. We'd like to have you join us on the next COVID panel as well. But I wanted to get into venture capital. And as you know, recently many people in the tech industry have been engaging in more frank discussions about the role that race plays when it comes to funding opportunities for early stage tech companies. So according to PitchBook, only 3% of VC partners in the US were Black, and Black founders accounted for just 1% of venture capital funding, and of that only 0.2% went to Black female founders. So I'd like to ask anybody on the panel if you can talk about your experience raising capital, what challenges you've faced.
I don't mind jumping in because I think I'm from a demographic that's the least funded. So in addition to the PitchBook study, I want to point to a couple of studies that changed my trajectory. So we spoke earlier about the journey, and I mentioned being an entrepreneur. I've been a serial entrepreneur. I've launched several companies. Some have failed. And, you know, I found similar challenges throughout. When I decided to come back into the tech industry, and I did it myself, I got in during the Napster era. I kind of had, even though I had this liberal arts background, I always had an affinity towards tech. And when I went into grad school and ultimately to UCLA, into the motion picture industry, I came with the perspective that the film industry was going to get disrupted by technology in much the same way as Napster. So when I was leaving the Bay Area going down to LA, Jesse Jackson was working to bridge the digital divide, but this was pre-Twitter, you know, Facebook. And so, you know, he was doing a lot of grassroots work, but there was no mechanism to really go viral. So a lot of this kind of got swept underneath the rug or stayed in like policy circles. And obviously, you know, 20 years later, it's 20 years later now, but when I got back into tech around 2014, the issues were the same. But again, I was naive in thinking that a lot of those problems had been solved. So when I started taking, you know, Kauffman Fellows Academy courses online to incubate my startup, CineShares, which I joined UCLA Ventures with, I didn't realize the systemic issues that still existed. I was familiar with systemic issues from education and housing and all these other finance, which I worked in finance as a FINRA licensed professional. And I wanted to bring the Jobs Act and these changes in policy back into opening up streams of distribution and ownership for our cultural product, because as I mentioned, my thesis as an undergrad, I knew that the images that we see of each other help shape our perceptions, because we do live in de facto segregation. And what I found was that the tech industry was very hostile to diversity. And you know, when I was going through an accelerator as a female founder fellow with the Founder Institute, when I, you know, even, you know, joining UCLA Ventures, there were barriers, there were implicit barriers. And I wasn't fully, I think maybe I was partially in denial, but when it became crystal clear what I was up against, it was when Richard Kirby, who was then VP at Venrock, came out with Who is a VC? And I have links that I'm happy to share out. And the same year, I believe it's 2016, Catherine Finney came out with Project Diane, which was the first study that actually delved into women, Black women in venture capital. And so I think part of it was like, for example, when I was working on CineShares, it was during the Mike Brown era at Ferguson that I think it was Mustafa, I think you brought that up earlier. And I remember speaking to one of my mentors and I said, look, I have this ethnic and Pan-African studies background. I really understand, you know, these discussions that are coming up in tech around diversity, and I want to contribute, but I am afraid that it will harm my career. And my mentor, who happened to be a white male, as many of my mentors have been, said, yeah, I wouldn't say anything. And I said to myself, well, you know what? I've been out here spinning my wheels. No one's giving me money anyway. You know, I have all these different barriers to entry because they say you have to have a technical co-founder. You have to have first money in from your friends and family round. And I don't have high net worth friends and family. They say that you know, every single barrier, I was not going to fit. And I'm looking at my peers like Joel Burke, who check all the boxes and they're not getting funding either. And I'm talking to their funders. I talked to Will Crowder that was at a Comcast, and he said, we tracked her 3 years. She's winning TechCrunch. She's winning all these pitch competitions. And they said, finally, we broke our own, you know, our own rules and we funded her because no one was funding her. And so I'm seeing my friends who are MIT, Stanford, MBA, CS majors, and they're not getting funding. I'm talking about Black women. I said, I'm spinning my wheels. So when these studies came out, I said, okay, it was already part of my 5-year plan as a Kauffman Fellows finalist to go into VC. I saw CineShares as VC for the motion picture industry. So I decided to prioritize that. And I think, Marion, you talk about the statistics, like there's 2 statistics, and I know other people have a lot to say about this, but when you mention the statistics, they are correlated to access to capital, for one. So we know like there's not that many venture capitalists, but when you even look at angel funding, I mentioned the friends and family round, the angel association, Angel Capital Association said that observed racial disparities may explain disparities in which entrepreneurs receive funding. In particular, investors tend to invest in people like them. So Harvard came out with a study about gender, where even female investors preferred attractive males to attractive females, and there's those studies. And there's many studies from LinkedIn did a study on diversity. It's found 40% of VCs didn't like the subject of diversity. The number of angel investors who are accredited investors, there's only 1.3% are Black, 2.3% are Hispanic, 5.7% are Asian, and 87.6% are white. So even before we get to VC, we don't have access to the friends and family money. And here's why. And you mentioned the policy part, and this came up twice. Here's why. Because right now under securities regulations, the SEC says if you don't make $200,000 a year for the past 2 years, or $300,000 as a household, and or have $1 million in net worth excluding your home, you cannot invest in a Reg D 506C offering, which is general solicitation. You can solicit outside of your network. So if you don't come from a high network and you want to do that kind of offering, you're limited to that pool of people who make that much. And there's all kinds of there's all kinds of intricacies that create barriers, systemic barriers for people of color to invest in themselves, in their communities. And this goes back to Black Wall Street. So I just want to throw those things out there, and I'm happy to share out the links to the research, and I'm sure other people have thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, Mustafa, you said you had a thought.
Yeah, no, Mariah, I hear you, and I think the thing about it is, one thing that you brought up is sort of, when we talk about racial wealth gap or wealth gaps along gender lines as well. And so I think those other things, those systemic issues and the cross sections and intersections of all of them are driving this. I think one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and I know some of the folks that are in the audience may have read a lot of research, and how do you address this, right? And I think addressing something at a systemic level, I think you have to think about process. And what I've seen is that the process by which you evaluate, and I'm talking about, in this case, professional investors, the process by which you evaluate startups has to become a lot better. It's no different from the process by which you should evaluate students as they are applying to the university and schools. And I think having a more broad-based method for doing that, and looking at the outcomes that you want to achieve, and looking at the factors that contribute to those outcomes is important. For instance, if you're only looking at test scores, right, you're going to get a certain demographic in your school. For looking at a space to see if this company is going to be successful, you have to evaluate founders fairly. I think understanding their background and not just their access and network, or their access to capital, is one thing. Now think about, Murray, you talk about sort of your background, and, thinking about the power of an immigrant and that immigrant experience, right? Understanding and having access to different markets. Talk about the grit, because I would say that's the number one thing for an entrepreneur to succeed. Is a lot of times, I bet that overlaps with the immigrant experience, or people from different communities. Access and understanding markets that are completely untapped. And so what I've seen is a lot of poor processes from venture capitalists. And in fact, I've seen almost no process a lot of times, because you're looking at, hey, provide me these projections or estimates and all that. All the stuff's made up, right? We all know it. Like when you're raising money at the very beginning, you just want to show a big market and have some basic assumptions. So, you know, great, I have some basic level of intelligence that I can show you about this market, until you get to the next stage where you really have KPIs and stuff like that. So what I would question is, do you truly have a process, a methodology to be able to be self-introspective about what you're doing and then improve that process? I know people use scorecards and stuff like that. I know others are completely averse to scorecards. So just thinking about that and grappling with it, I think is a way to do it. And in 10 seconds, I'll tell you my experience in closing the seed round. The reason, like we basically ran out of money twice. And the way that this came through was we were part of an accelerator, but a guy who was at Titletown Tech, who's the director of finance there, he played basketball. He was an African-American guy. He understood the market. He understood the language. He had access to coaches. He could really dive in and check this industry. And I feel like there was no, obviously, like, he really got it. And then from there, with his stamp of approval to present to the other partners, we had a true opportunity. And once we were in there, I've seen, like, Titletown has been a tremendous resource for us. But sometimes if you don't have that person that can kind of cut through it or look through it, you might be stuck. And Mariah kind of has talked about that experience. So yeah, process is what I would focus on.
I just want to kind of jump in just to kind of write off what you just said. And one of the things you said that I think really struck is the idea behind markets, right? There are completely untapped markets. You know, there are completely untapped way of doing things that I think for a lot of investors that just simply sometimes don't have the framework to really fully understand, but are unwilling to really dig deeper than to stay on the surface. And that is unfortunate, because I think a lot of people are missing great opportunities to invest in potentially, you know, new markets and new ways of doing things that they really are not doing at the moment. You know, I'm fortunate in the sense that we, you know, managed to get you know, a lot of the friends and families from my friends who are physicians themselves and kind of understood what we're doing. So once we had an MVP, it was easy to convince some of our physician friends to put money in because they understood the problem well. But you know, one of the big challenges we've had is we are in Africa, and we've had to pay attention to actually trying to raise from Africa-specific investors, as opposed to investors here who just simply say, hey, Africa is what? You know, and some of them are actually surprised to find out that Kenya had one of the fastest internet speeds last year in the world. I think the second fastest behind South Korea. And so when you're doing an internet dependent thing, they're looking at you like, well, do they even use internet in Africa? It's some of these kind of crazy things that you hear because people are really not taking the time to actually understand what you're trying to say. And this applies to, you know, inner city neighborhoods and all this, you know, it's an extension, it's a worldwide issue that you see that there's a market in inner city neighborhoods, for example, that can be tapped. If a Black entrepreneur wants to solve that issue and the person on the other side doesn't quite understand the issue, they're probably going to be dismissive. So one of the things that investors really need to start doing is actually be curious. Be curious, because if you are, you actually take the time to understand, ask the relevant questions, get educated about it, so that you can actually make an educated decision on who you should invest in and who you should not invest in.
I think, Elon, you wanted to share something?
Yes, I think there have been excellent points made by all of the panelists. I'd like just to piggyback off of a few things that I've heard. I think I heard some things from Mustafa I'd like to build upon. One of the most important things I think that people of color, African Americans, we have that's particularly difficult is we don't grow up in an environment in which people even understand what venture capital is. What's venture capital? What's an angel investor? What's a loan? To us, it's all just various forms of money, none of which we're familiar with. So I think even the vocabulary of the startup world is a bit different for us. We might understand the dynamics of a small business because maybe our family owned a small business, but this is very opaque. And I think we need chaperones or guides to help us into that world, to at least help us understand the language. I think if you watch television, you watch a popular movie, you think that if you make an excellent pitch deck, you went to a stellar top 25 undergraduate university, you're highly articulate, and you meet with a VC, the rest is history. And that's just not how it works in the startup land. It just doesn't. And we have not been given the proper guide rails. We don't have the proper mentors to set us up for success. So maybe if we meet with that VC for the very first time, we're not prepared. I think preparation is key. I think everyone on the panel will agree with that. I think part of what we have to be able to do, all of us on the panel, is for those who come after us, we help them prepare. We give them some sense of optimism, but communicating clearly, the odds of failure are about 99.9%. But that 0.1% of success is going to be fantastic. But I think we are the generation that's going to have to lead the next generation of entrepreneurs. I know all of us are trying to be entrepreneurs ourselves, but we may be wave one that's actually going to end up helping wave two.
And Bob, you said you had something to share as well.
Yes. One way that you prepare the road for success is to really understand the environment that you're playing in. And we all know that access to capital for Black entrepreneurs is very difficult, from VC and to a lesser extent angel sources. So a philosophy that we have executed on from the very beginning, maybe it's because of my corporate entrepreneurship background, is to focus on the entities that have the problem that you're trying to solve and go to them as initial customers and convince them to partner with you to address the problem that you've identified, which you know that they have. And that's proven to be an effective way of getting initial funding. And it's the best kind of funding because you don't give up equity. It's the customer that's paying dollars and funding the implementation of the solution that they need and enabling you to go forward to provide that solution to others who have the same problem. That's my comment.
Thank you for that. We are getting close to the end, so I'm going to ask if any audience members have any questions to submit them through the Q&A function down at the bottom. If not, I will go through a few of the other questions I had. Essentially, I think a lot of you've already sort of answered some of this, but how can groups like UCLA Ventures support your respective startups as well as the next generation of Black entrepreneurs?
I have one of our investors is a group called Portfolio, and I think they're terrific. They focus on woman-led companies, and they also have a sort of a Rising America Fund, which is on sort of underrepresented founders. And one of the women who's on their board is also on our board. Her name is Barbara Clark, and Barbara's take on all of this is write the damn checks. She says, you know, the diversity theater and all that kind of stuff. So when it comes down to it, she says, write the damn checks. And in this case, UCLA Ventures doesn't write checks. But I think the thing is to, the support is to make those connections. And then when it comes to, you know, the true evaluation, when you're either early and you're betting on people, or later and you're betting on the actual company, is to take an action. And so I think groups like that, one, can provide the mentorship and the preparation that Alon and Dr. Dansby mentioned. But now beyond that is when it comes to the funding is to take an action, write the check.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think recently over these last few weeks as more, or over this last, right now, more people have been talking about how the tech industry can help. And the hashtag that popped up was hire and wire. Hire more Black entrepreneurs, Black tech people, and wire the cash, invest in these startups. Actions, I think, are what's going to change. You know, talking is important, learning is important. I'm glad we're doing this, but at the end of the day, action is what is going to provide the next generation with more opportunity.
And from the investor point of view, like I can appreciate that, especially with my founder hat on. I wish some people had just, you know, everyone wants to be a mentor, but like how many are willing to open up the network or open up their pocketbook? And it can feel really frustrating when you're getting, you know, they say ask for advice, you get, you know, money, ask for money, you get advice. It can be really frustrating when no matter what you do, you just get a bunch of advice and redirecting, and you know, like you're just not good enough, even though you're working twice as hard and getting all the results. Otherwise, like making out $1 out of 15 cents. But I will say, like from the investor side, you don't just put money into companies that are just going to fail, because then that's not helping, because then there's going to be a stereotype that, you know, just like some people say, oh, you're lowering the bar, or, you know, all the arguments that come up with affirmative action, you know, all these negative concepts come from people trying to take a shortcut. So I think the important thing is educate yourself as to the barriers of entry, educate yourself as to the history of Black entrepreneurship, like the Black Wall Street documentaries, and learn the painful history of why there is a wealth gap. And it's not just because we don't educate ourselves. We're going into debt to educate ourselves. Black women are the most educated demographic in America. And we don't have the historical wealth because of the redlining, because of, you know, not being insured, because of all of these systemic issues. We don't have that wealth to not take the loans, to be able to go and buy a house without a high debt to income ratio, because we're paying off our student loans. So learn the systemic barriers, number one, and that can help reduce the cognitive dissonance to where when you do see excellence, you're ready to make that investment. So, you know, that's one thing I can say for me personally, as an Aspen Tech Policy Hub Fellow. I'm working on a project to close the tech funding gap that deals with both the SEC and deals with also creating opportunities for emerging managers like myself to develop a track record, because that's another barrier. When you hear you've got to put this percentage of your own net worth into a fund, you got to spin out of a firm, you know, how many investments have you made? And if you're not getting hired into the firms in the first place, it's really hard to to check those boxes, right? But that doesn't mean that you don't have the ability, because when the first investor started on Sand Hill Road, guess what? They didn't have that track record. So that's one. And also, I am an emerging manager. My job is to raise capital and deploy. And, you know, we're the most underrepresented demographic in venture capital. So I'll put information if there are accredited investors listening who want to invest in impact funds that don't lower the bar, that have deal flow into diverse talent. And not only that, look at the teams that you're seeing that may not be led by founders of color or Black founders. Can you expand your network or tap into networks to where you can create opportunities for executives and talent of color to come in and have early ownership in those companies? Because, you know, that's the problem with tech not being diverse is, you know, we're not getting those shares that are now exiting so that we can go and invest. Again, they're barriers to wealth creation and access to capital. So, you know, look at the systemic issues. I would say do all the things in parallel. Don't cherry pick one thing like, okay, diversity is going to mean women until we get the numbers on women up. No, we deal with complexity all the time in tech, and we can walk and chew gum. So educate yourself to the systemic issues and take proactive action.
Yes, I love it. We have another question from the audience. Are there ways to hire felons at a startup to provide them with skill set liquidity, so to speak, that can help them achieve a better level of success during reassimilation? Joe, do you want to take this one?
Sure, thank you. So there are so many organizations that are really trying to help these folk through reentry. And our policy within Sprocket is to go to as many of these organizations and find these folks to bring them into Sprocket to work in various capacities, whether it is on the technical side or the marketing side or the outreach, training, any of those aspects. And then we also bring in a lot of mentors into the company so that the skill set of these individuals are being raised, that we're not just leaving them out there to swing in the wind without support. So it's a very difficult, not only transition, but transformation to go from incarceration into society. And so it takes a lot of patience. For us to have built the second version of Sprocket with incarcerated coders took a lot longer because they had no ability to communicate with the outside world unless we went in. So they couldn't get on Slack or GitHub or any of that. So they were figuring it out themselves. They only had 4 to 6 hours a day to actually work on the platform, and only 4 days per week. Those are the rules of the Prison Industry Association. So there are certain limitations, but if that is the commitment, then you go after it as stubbornly as possible. And what we found is that it then brings in folks who want to support us in what we do, and jurisdictions who are looking for that kind of innovation within the way that they perform criminal justice. And we're in a really unusual time, because if you look at incarceration, it's been the same for centuries, right? You put somebody in a concrete box with iron bars. That really hasn't changed. We're at a new place now where at least they're looking at policing and reforms to policing, but we have to change incarceration and reentry. And there is that open-mindedness for it. And we are just doggedly and stubbornly proceeding down that path. It took several years where it felt like we weren't getting anywhere, and we were hiring previously incarcerated, and they were having real frustrations about the stigma that's involved in working in criminal justice when you have that kind of a record. But we can see it and feel it changing, and it's a hopeful time, I think, for all of us to see that the society wants that change. So the opportunities that these entrepreneurs are presenting, it's starting to happen now in a way that I haven't seen ever before.
Yeah. So I want to be mindful of time. We do have a few other interesting questions that we might want to get to, but if the panelists have a few more minutes, we can go through them. If not, we're able to answer them privately, and I'll be sending an email to all the attendees and the audience with sort of links and questions. But let me know if you guys have time for a few more. Or one more, maybe like 5 minutes or so. One question, and this is sort of piggybacking off of what Elon said earlier. One of our members asked how many of you had mentors as you were forming your companies. We know that mentorship is something that's very important. Mentors help you sort of figure out how not to do things, which ways, they share their failures with you. And it's an advantage that a lot of people have that, people of color tend to not really seek out, or there aren't a lot of opportunities to sort of find mentors. And so we wanted to know how many of you had that and benefited from having a mentor.
Can I answer that one starting off with? Is that okay?
Yes.
So I picked 2 mentors, 2 advisors that I added to my company early on as first step. And it was funny that I added corporate advisors. And what I realized along the way, I ended up needing startup advisors. And both were valuable. And they're both incredibly valuable. But I didn't know, again, you don't know what you don't know. I didn't understand that the terrain of a startup land is very different than the terrain of a corporate world. And they ended up, the 2 I barely knew in the startup world, they're still helping me today. And they were extremely valuable in setting expectations and preparing me for, I would say, the gauntlet that was ahead of me.
I mirror that. I've got an advisor, his name is Arian Forhar. who built and sold his company to Sport Radar, which is a big data company. And he's a UCLA alum, which is also good. But the way that I've approached it is I was always pretty thoughtful but liberal with equity, because I think those people were not in my network. And once you get them, I think giving them as much buy-in as possible, and he would have done it without having equity, but I think it sets a tone of mentorship, but also professionalism to it, and it kind of puts people in the fight with you. And then the other thing I would say is, for me, is my co-founder. So she is be a really quick story. It's basically, long story short, we met with each other. I got connected to her as being sort of an advisor or whatever, and I told her all this stuff, and I was enthusiastic, and I was really young. I was just coming back from Europe, and on and on and on. And she was like, don't do this. Don't do this. Don't spend this money. She's Russian. Don't do this. Don't do this. And I was like, man, she's so negative. And then 3 months later, I was like, that lady was right. And she had been through it before. She'd raised money before. And that was when sort of mentor advisor, I said, forget that. Like, we're going to find a way to work together. And so I think being sort of very thoughtful, but liberal with, hey, let's see what you got. And then structure the advisor package fine. Like, have a small cliff if you're worried about any of those things. But I think that's the way that you can really approach it.
So I'll jump in on that. I remember being like 12, reading a book on mentorship, and it was very centered on men and men's mentors and like the cycle of mentorship, like the fallen mentor. And so that left an impression on me really early, to where I thought, well, I'm not a man, but I think I need a mentor if I have these ambitions in life. So I always sought out mentors. However, I would say that mentors have not always been so eager to mentor me. So I was part of, for example, a mentorship program. And I remember my mentor, who was president of a major production studio, he would always say, well, I never had mentors, and he didn't come from like a high net worth background per se. But he kind of felt like, I got the impression from him that he really felt like diversity was some advantage. And like we've heard our president say that in our archival information, that somehow in getting into this mentorship program with him, I had some unfair advantage. And this came up recently, Chris Saka, another story I won't get into, but he said something about this being an opportunity for general partners to have an unfair advantage, using a common term in venture capital. And so I'll say, like, I think that belied a bias, for one, an assumption that we have equal access to opportunities, and we don't. And even though he felt like he never had a mentor, he didn't realize that being a white cis male, he's surrounded by people that open doors for him and expect him to progress. Whereas I could do the same. We could both be serving coffee, and people will be so used to and comfortable to me serving coffee all day long, they'll never give me a seat at the table. Whereas they might say, hey, young man, you've been serving coffee for a while. Why don't you take on this project? That's a fact. That's what the data shows. So, I've been very proactive, and I've sought out mentors in the private sector, people who have had exits, and I have had to deal with the Me Too issues. So that, we got to look at intersectionality. So what I said in the response here is I've had a number of mentors. Some have been great, some have opened doors, but I have rarely found mentors that came from my socioeconomic background. I've rarely had mentors that had the bandwidth that understood my intersectionality, because you got one, woman who makes it, she's got 500,000 other women pulling on her coattails saying, mentor me. And it's an extra burden. And so I'll say that, although I've pursued mentorship and I've had mentors, I don't think the experience is the same. I don't think that, I went to a private school where I was the first person from a public school background that some of these people had ever experienced. And just having access to that circle of privilege doesn't mean that people are going to convey their privilege unto you. So it's only been recently, really, I had this experience of a woman who actually opened up her Rolodex and said, we're going to go through and call these people, and I'm going to tell them that they need to invest in you. And that is edification. And so there's a difference between mentorship and sponsorship, because sponsors actually, they take a stake, they act on your behalf, they put themselves out there for you. Because it's not just mentorship that people need. They need sponsors to help them overcome the disparities. And I've heard, from, even here, we're not a monolith. Everyone here has a different experience. I'm not going to have the same experience that Joe has. I'm not going to have the same experience that Dr. Raifu has being Ghanaian. My husband is from Botswana. There's different dynamics of being American born, where you come from a people who have been terrorized as a minority, and coming from a majority country and having an opportunity to come here and have different values instilled. You know, I also am a mixed person. I have a different experience than the next person of color who might never had the privilege of education, or coming from a family where my grandmother left me a trust fund that paid for 1 year of grad school without me having to work. So I think, you know, we have to look at, you know, all of those different things, and focus not just on mentorship when we're talking about mentorship, but sponsorship, to bring down those barriers to entry, to level the playing field, and to understand that the experiences are truly different for people of color, especially Black people.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add something to that? If not, I think there's one more question that I think it's relevant, because a lot of our members are leaders in their companies. And so as leaders of your respective companies, how do you think company culture can be sculpted to be more inclusive and supportive of Black entrepreneurs?
Hiring.
I'll start.
There you go.
You're muted.
Go ahead.
I don't quite understand the question. You said hiring folks in your company, or?
Yeah, so like the how you can change your company culture. Yeah, so that includes sort of hiring, or even going past hiring, making them feel like they're a part of the company and that they have a stake in the company.
Be a decent human being. I mean, you know, we talk about a lot of these things, and it comes down to basically fundamentally treating people like they should be treated. And when you find a situation where people feel unwelcomed, when people feel like they don't have an ability that they could work as hard as they can, but the ability to move up the ladder is not there, you're not treating them as human beings, and you're not being a decent human being. It's really, for me, it's not that complicated. It's just people have to go back to the fundamental of being themselves decent human beings and being fair to people. And that's extremely important. I think, you know, it's never crossed my mind, this concept that Black folks don't have the capacity to excel at anything. It doesn't even cross my mind. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but those kind of thoughts don't cross my mind. So I'm always kind of surprised when I encounter people who think otherwise, right? Because it's kind of strange, honestly, and I see it's more of a deficiency on their part than anything else. So you know, if you are an entrepreneur, you know, you can be an entrepreneur of color and still not treat Black folks right. I mean, I don't know if some of you guys have been on Twitter. There've been some things coming out on very majority Black companies lately where Black women have not felt treated with respect in these companies. So this really goes beyond race. It goes at the heart of it is whoever is in the leadership position and the position of power needs to treat people with respect, and they need to be decent human beings themselves. It's not that complicated, and give everybody an equal shot. They do the work, they should have the opportunity.
I would add to that too, and I put a link in, you know, with some of these topics that we've discussed. I'll share this other link as well. There's a post I put on LinkedIn that a woman wrote about white women being advocates for women of color in the workplace, and just addressing the fact that Black women can do tons of work, tons more work, and they're not acknowledged. If they make a mistake, they're punished more harshly. They have to deal with stereotypes. If you're, you know, assertive, you're looked at as being aggressive, or the angry Black woman trope. There's, you know, there's just all of these things. And so again, that goes back to just educating self. But I think a lot of emphasis is put on, oh, okay, let's do ERGs, which are great, love ERGs. Employee resource groups, they have affinities like for, you know, Black employees or whatnot. There's a lot of emphasis on, you know, pipeline, which is a myth, because if you want to recruit a top athlete, you're going to go across the country, you're going to wine and dine, you're going to do whatever you have to do. If you want to hire people of color and black employees into your tech company, do the work. I will tell you, I knew some people who came in to intern in a corporate capital group that shall not be named, and 4 Black, 1 Hispanic, Latinx, and they were one was told by HR, "You guys are smarter than we thought that you would be." And he said, "I am from an affluent Black community in Florida. I have never seen poor Black people before I moved to California." And there's reasons for that, and the deindustrialization that took place in the Bay Area, to where maybe people on Sand Hill, the majority of people they see are of color, are in positions of service and may not have the same education or class background as they do, but that doesn't mean that that's what the dynamic is across the country, or that those people aren't smart for that matter. And so I say all that to say, when you're dealing with improving diversity or representation within corporate America, look at the culture that you have, because that young man said, "I'm going back to Florida. I don't want to be on Sand Hill Road. I don't want to be in Silicon Valley." And that is not a problem that Black people should have to face. If you have people who are microaggressing, who are assuming that people aren't qualified, who have unchecked biases just because you've never addressed the issue, and you're putting all this work on people of color or a single diversity and inclusion representative, and you're not going out doing the work as a leader, and you're not addressing the toxic culture within, you're going to have a revolving door. So start sitting down with the people that aren't of color and find out what their issues are, even if they're afraid to speak them, because they're out there. They're out there. You don't have to even survey people about their beliefs to know what the common refrain is. I know it because I've done the work and I hear it all the time. So educate yourself as to what that is, and help to educate the people already within the organization. So when you bring in people of color, it's not a toxic culture that they don't want to be part of.
Thank you for that.
We all need to be part of the solution. We all have very busy schedules, I'm sure, lots of challenges and pressures to keep our own ventures running smoothly and successfully. But we also have to be committed to being mentors ourselves and to creating channels for rising tech people and other venture interested parties to become members of successful teams. So to the extent that we can work together to create such channels, I think we can be part of the solutions.
I would say, you know, as a father, you learn really quickly once your kids become teenagers that you're not as cool as you thought you were. And they are happy to remind you often. And so I take the same attitude as the head of this company, is that we have to be pretty intentional about what we're trying to do, and to assume that we're failing on some level and to listen to the criticism very carefully. And I constantly am amazed and enlightened by my team, mostly because they have that experience that I don't have, which is why I do seek out as diverse a group as I possibly can, not just of color, but of background, and certainly of criminal justice background. And I think this is a wonderful situation right now of all of us listening to one another. The more we listen, the more I think we're going to learn. I really appreciate this time.
Unless Mustafa and Alon want to say some final words, we can wrap up, but I'll give you an opportunity if you want.
I think everything has been very well said. So no, I support all of those reflections.
I'm good, thank you.
Yeah, no, and thank you guys so much for your time and for going over a little bit. I think this is a really important discussion. The theme of listening and educating yourself, I think, is one that we are trying to push, me personally, but also we at UCLA Ventures. So we plan to share this with our network, which includes, you know, a lot of investors, entrepreneurs, and just general UCLA alumni and people of the community. So, so thank you again so much for sharing your experience and having this talk. And thank you for all the attendees for listening. Again, we'll send a follow-up email with a few links and a few dates for upcoming panels that we're going to have as well. Thank you.